Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 165, IO 531, B to D. We've seen that so far Socrates and Io are talking at cross purposes about understanding a poet. Socrates is pushing Io to talk about what the poet actually means, while Io concentrates on the exposition of the poetry, so that we may say that Socrates is using an intellectual approach while Io is using an aesthetic approach to the interpretation of a poet. Presumably in an attempt to clarify the problem, Socrates has introduced Hesiod as a comparison to Homer, and still Io is talking about the aesthetic rather than the intellectual similarities and differences between them. Actually, they've only talked about the similarities so far. I suspect that that was a deliberate choice by Socrates to begin with the similarities, because obviously where Homer and Hesiod are similar, they are similar aesthetically as well as intellectually. And this eases Io into a comparison between the two. We should recall that comparing and contrasting are features of dialectic method. Now Socrates turns to the differences between Homer and Hesiod. Tide hon peri me tauta legusin, hoion peri mantikes legeti Homeros de kai Hesiodos. Panunge. What about the things they don't say the same things, such as about prophecy? Both Homer and Hesiod say something. Yes, absolutely. The gradual shift from style to subject suggests to me that Socrates is gradually pulling the conversation towards the intellectual and away from the aesthetic. Socrates now adds yet another element which drives the conversation towards the intellectual and away from the aesthetic. Tiun, hosete homoios kai hoset diaphoros perimantikes legeton to poieta tuto, potron su kalion an exegesaio, eton mantiontis ton agathon. Ton mantion. What then? As many things as these two poets say similarly and differently about prophecy, would you expound more beautifully than one of the prophets, the good ones, one of the prophets? Socrates has completely changed the comparison. It used to be between Homer and Hesiod, but now it doesn't matter whether Homer and Hesiod say the same thing or different things. Now it matters whether they agree or disagree with the prophets, the ones who actually know the subject that they're talking about. The assumption here, of course, is that an expert on prophecy will say the correct thing about any particular matter, and we must take what the prophet says as true and then compare what Homer and Hesiod say about that matter and decide which of them is more correct. In other words, closer to what the prophet says. And this is not the same thing as deciding which poet is speaking more beautifully about the subject, and by extension, when the rhapsode is talking more beautifully, when he is Homer or when he is Hesiod, given that the rhapsode is supposed to be imitating the poet. The poet speaks through the rhapsode. Also notice that an expert prophet is a good one. Expertise is considered good. We should note that Socrates asked whether Io would expound more beautifully than one of the prophets. He uses the word kalion, which is the comparative of kalos. We see that Socrates means to ask whether Io would expound better, not more beautifully. And we've already seen this in other dialogues, that kalos is understood by most Greeks as beautiful and good, and is usually translated by us nowadays as fine, which covers both good and beautiful. So Socrates' question could be translated as, would you expound more finely? However, I think that this translation would miss an important point here, that Socrates is allowing Io to think that we're still talking about aesthetics, although Socrates himself and the argument itself are requiring us to think about the subject matter of the poem and not the style. By the way, why does Io think that a prophet would know better than Homer or Hesiod what prophecy is about? Well, when it comes to techne, most Greeks would agree that the expert in a techne is better in that subject than anybody else. And a rhapsode's techne is not specifically about prophecy. There is mantike techne, the techne of the prophet. So obviously a prophet would know better than a poet about the subject matter of prophecy. Io shouldn't feel too threatened about this, because he still has his rhapsodike techne, the art of the rhapsode. Socrates continues, Edesu estamantis, uk, eper periton homoios legomenon hoios testa exegesestai, kai periton diaphoros legomenon episto an exegestai. Deilon hoti. But if you were a prophet, wouldn't it be the case that if indeed you were able to expound about the things said similarly, that is between Homer and Hesiod, wouldn't you understand also how to expound about the things said differently? It's clear that I would. Socrates is basically asking Io to think like a prophet. He's already agreed that the prophets would always be able to explain things better than a rhapsode. So now all Socrates has done is ask whether, if Io were, instead of a rhapsode, a prophet, wouldn't he know how to expound on the differences and the similarities between Homer and Hesiod when it comes to prophecy? The only reason I can see for this simple change with a very long sentence is to put Io into the shoes of a technites, a craftsman who is not a rhapsode, in an attempt to make Io think about the subject matter of a techne in a clearer way than is the case in Rhapsody, where a rhapsode does think about the subject matter of Rhapsody, but that happens to be the style concerning other things. The other things are the subject matter of other technai, other crafts. Socrates now returns to the distinction Io himself made between his ability to expound Homer and his inability to expound other poets. Tiun pote perimen Homeru de nos peride Hesiodu udeton alon poeton. What on earth then are you terrific about Homer, but not about Hesiod, and not about the other poets. The actual answer would be that Io is an expert on the style of Homer, but the previous conversation has been about the subject matter, and that's a non sequitur when it comes to the problem Io has. Io evidently doesn't answer this difficult question because Socrates continues. E Homeros peri allon tinon lege e hon per sumpantes hoi alloi poietai? Does Homer speak about some other things than about the things which all the other poets speak? U peri polemu teta pola dieleluthen, kai peri homilion prosalelus anthropon agathon te kai kakon, kai dioton, kai demiurgon, kai peri theon prosalelus, kai pros anthropus homilunton, hos homilusi, kai periton uranion pathematon, kai periton enadu, kai genesis, kai theon, kai heroon, u tautaesti perihon homeros ten poiesin pepoieken? Ale the leges, O Socrates. Isn't it the case that he detailed many things about war and about conversations between humans, both good and bad and private and public, and about gods talking to each other and to humans as they talk, and about heavenly events, and about the events in Hades, and the births both of gods and of heroes? Aren't these the same things about which Homer has produced his production? You say true things. Tide hoi alloi poietai uperiton auton tuton? Nai, al Socrates homoios pepoiekas kai Homeros. And what about the other poets? Don't they talk about the very same things? Yes, but Socrates, they haven't produced similarly as Homer has, and so we're back to style. I've been translating anything to do with poetry as production. The verb poieo can generally be translated as to do or to make, but here produce works better. The poietes, poet, is a producer. A poema, a poem, is a production, and poiesis, poesy in Old English, is the act of producing. Io is now able to say that Homer is different from the other poets in the way that he composes, produces his poetry, because Socrates has pushed him to say this.